Hello everyone, my name is Anthony Pannone, and this is my part 6 of the Teacher Candidate Work Sample, where I will be going in depth on the unit I taught, why it was important to teach it, how I constructed my lessons and assessments, and what the results of those assessments showed in terms of student growth. But first I wanted to provide just a little background information on the class I taught. For my first placement of student teaching, I was assigned to teach at Cumberland High School with Miss McDonald, who is also a professor at Rhode Island College, who I actually had as a student in HP 200. She has an incredibly welcoming personality, which I assume is the main reason why she's always tasked with teaching the freshmen. And while I'm comfortable teaching any grade for the most part, I was a little bit more comforted knowing that I would be teaching the same grade that I taught at my practicum placement in Pannone. And I even got to teach part of my relationship finals unit that I taught at Pano with the Cumberland kids. The focus of this work sample unit was not on that, it was on STIs. And with this was actually a unit within a unit. So the unit was actually a sex ed unit that I taught, but the three lessons that I constructed for the work sample was on sexually transmitted infections. The unit included 3 total lessons and a performance assessment. I had as many as 29 freshmen in one class, but for the one that I chose for my work sample, I only had 18, which was by far the smallest class that I had taught. So why is teaching about STIs so important at the high school level? Well, for starters, STIs are incredibly common. I'm not going to lie, when I started researching for this unit, I didn't know everything there was to know about STIs, and one of the statistics that kind of blew my mind was the fact that 1 in 5 Americans currently have an STI, and the fact that every year there's around 26 million new infections. The more alarming part from a high school educator's perspective is the fact that nearly half of those new infections are from people aged 15 to 24. Now, most of the students in my class are 14, 15 years old, so now seems like a pretty good time to start educating them on STIs. Based on the statistics from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, it shows that nearly half of high school students have had sexual intercourse. So if that many students are going to be sexually active at some point in their high school experience, it's probably important that they know how to protect themselves at some point, right, from the risks associated with having sex, whether it's protected or unprotected. Um, this is kind of where the health belief model comes into play. If students don't have a perceived risk with a problem, then they probably aren't going to do everything in their power to protect themselves from that problem. But if they see the risk associated with something like unprotected sex, then they're probably going to try to take action and help protect themselves from that disease. For this unit, I wanted to specifically focus on prevention and testing. So as I go through the slides, I'll go into more detail as to what I actually taught and what activities I did. But for now, I'll just kind of explain what the topics were that I covered in the unit and how I went about planning it. So right around the time I administered my pretest, I found out that students were already exposed to an STI lesson in middle school. I'm not going to lie, that got me a little concerned that I was going to just be teaching them repetitive information. Even some of the students commented and were a little skeptical as to why they were being taught the same unit again. But I quickly gained a sigh of relief after seeing the pre-test results. I even played a Jeopardy game with them at the start of the sex ed unit, which incorporated questions on STIs. They were clueless. Come to find out that their middle school lesson was just them looking at pictures of STIs and getting grossed out. That was pretty much what their lesson consisted of. So, especially since their pre-test results were so low and I learned that information, I really wanted to make sure to stress the basics. So, during my first lesson, students learned the basics of STIs. I gave them a link to explore that went along with the worksheet that they filled out. They learned about the difference between STIs and STDs, common symptoms, how they're spread. They also did a more hands-on activity that drove home the point of how quickly STIs can spread. And then from there they focused more on prevention methods such as using condoms, limiting partners, having open and honest communication with their partner, and testing. Testing was the focus of the last lesson. However, due to time, that lesson got cut down a little bit. While I wanted to make sure I stressed the basics of STIs, ultimately my goal was I wanted students to be able to provide reliable health information on STIs. For my first of 4 objectives, I wanted students to be able to analyze prevention guidelines from credible sources such as the CDC or Planned Parenthood, and this ties specifically into Standard 1, which is comprehending concepts. For Objective 2, the focus was on assessing that valid information from those valid sources, which obviously accessing valid information is connected to Standard 3. Objectives 3 and 4 focused on advocacy, specifically being able to use valid information to advocate for themselves and others while being able to persuade while advocating. For all my objectives, my target was 80% of students to meet objective. I felt like this was a pretty reasonable number. I didn't want to set the bar too high, especially after seeing some of the pre-assessment results, but I also didn't want to set the bar too low. I knew I wasn't going to be going too in-depth with the content, especially seeing how little students knew going into it. So students should have been able to meet standard pretty easily, which they, for the most part, did. So even in the past, I've expressed that I'm not really a huge fan of assessment data. Personally, I feel that teacher observations based on questioning and class discussion can give you a pretty good read on the situation. At least I feel for me it does. But for the assessments that I did run out in this placement, specifically for lessons 1 and 3, I had students fill out a Google form as an exit ticket for them to take. Lesson 2, they created an advocacy poster. I was initially going to do a third Google form, but students told me that they enjoyed some of the previous activities that required coloring and drawing, so I decided to switch it up for them. Here are a few of the templates for worksheets that I gave out during my lesson. The first one on the left was used for students to gather basic STI information. I used Google Classroom and posted multiple valid links for students to use to gather this information, and we eventually went over everything. The second worksheet corresponded with a video that I showed at the beginning of class. They had to watch the video, see the prevention methods used, and write why those methods are effective at lessening the spread of STIs. This information also helped them with their advocacy poster. I actually got this idea from Dr. Clark. I think it was in drug ed. Students had to create an advocacy poster on the prevention of STIs. The poster had to illustrate 5 symptoms of STIs trying to attack them, and as protection, they had to illustrate 5 ways to lessen that spread of STIs. It was pretty cool to see some of the creativity that students had. We had some students use like shields and superheroes to try to protect themselves. Some use football players with like the linemen trying to protect the quarterback. You can see a couple of the examples of student work on the right. One of my favorite activities that I facilitated was the helmet activity. For this activity, students were given one of the 4 helmets shown below. Each helmet had a hidden meaning related to STIs. The A represented abstinence, the CU represented a condom used, the U represented being unprotected, and the I represented having an infection. Before knowing this, students had to walk around the room and gather 3 signatures on their helmet. These signatures represented a sexual encounter. The concept of this activity is not original. It's often done just using an index card, but I found that to be kind of boring, so I modified it, made it a little bit more engaging, and the kids loved it. They were really thrown for a loop when I told them that their signature represented a sexual encounter. So this was their performance assessment. Advocacy and using and providing people with valid information was the focal point of this PA. There were a few parts of this assignment. First, students had to provide basic STI information on the worksheet that's on the right. From there, they had to create an infographic using Canva. I was kind of shocked to learn that most students had no exposure to Canva at all. I thought that was something that most students were at least somewhat familiar with, but I would say close to 95% of these students had never seen it in their life. A lot of them were not too pleased about doing part 3. Um, for that part, they had to present their canvas to a family member. But I actually got a pretty good response rate for this. Even Miss McDonald was a little surprised by the return rate. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I tied it to their summative grade, which is worth 55% of their final grade. So it meant a little bit more to make sure that they got this done. So this is my rubric with a few examples of some of the higher and lower grades to the left and right. I found this pretty easy to use. If I could change one thing about the rubric, it would probably be the verbiage in the how it is spread category. I had 2 questions from the worksheet that were tied to this one specific category, and the description is fairly broad as to what it was that I was looking for. But other than that, I felt like the rubric was fairly easy to use, so I would use it again with the slight modification to that first category. So these are a couple examples of the finished product, as well as the family engagement sheet filled out. These are 2 of the better canvas. The ones that received poor grades were pretty obvious why. No pictures, no color, no effort. They basically just typed information into a blank infographic and called it a day. Here's my data for my first objective. This objective was tied to analyzing the prevention of disease. Students got good exposure to this objective throughout the unit. They were working towards this objective as they were using their links to provide information on their worksheets, watching an Amaze video on STI prevention, which, by the way, is an amazing source if you're ever playing in a sex ed unit and you need information or videos. The prevention poster also helps students work towards this objective. Of the 4 objectives that I had, this is the one that students did the best on, and I think it's because of how much exposure they had to it. I think students would have done even better if I had more time. I didn't really get into a ton of higher level questioning, but I had a lot of information to cover and not a lot of time to teach it. So in the next couple of slides, you'll see some of the stuff that I had to cut from the unit. One of the focal points of this unit was for students to use valid resources and to access valid STI information. And while students met this objective, they did not really get the exposure to it that I wanted them to get. The slide presentations I used were helpful, and the videos and links that students were accessing were great as well, but I had to cut one of the lessons short that would have been probably the most helpful to them. Students were supposed to research a local test center that they could use to gather information. Unfortunately, due to the lack of time, students had to hear me lecture about this rather than do the hands-on activity that I had initially planned for. Knowing where to find a local test center is how students were evaluated on the PA, so I think the result of this would have been much better if they had done the hands-on activity rather than just hearing me lecture. But I think that was one of the things that I learned as a more full-time teacher, is that not everything that you planned is going to always happen the way you expected it to. So this objective was all about advocating for themselves and others. The target for this objective was 80%. The class average was a 78, so they weren't too far off. In addition to researching a local test center, I was going to have students actually physically call a test center. They were going to write down questions they had about STIs, and they were going to call that test center directly, so that way they could go through the process of making that uncomfortable call now. This is something that I really wanted to see play out. It's something that Miss McDonald has done with her classes in the past, but unfortunately, this is with the amount of time I had left in the health room, it was not something that I could have realistically done. Although they did not get that exposure, they did have exposure to advocacy throughout their unit, through their poster, class discussion, videos, but especially since students earned a 0 on this specific objective in the pretest, I'd say students made fairly good growth even though they didn't quite get to that 80% mark that I was looking for. Objective 4 was based on their ability to persuade others in making a health-enhancing decision. Similar to my last objective, the class was just a tick below that 80% target line. The objective was met based on their presentations to a family member of the Canvas. Students had some practice presenting while providing health information prior to their PA. Students had to research and present a birth control method to the class as a whole, but this wasn't specifically part of this unit, but it was done prior to the PA, and it certainly tied into this specific objective. I also had to deal with some technical issues that probably impacted this objective and the last one. While the students were able to access Canva no problem on their Chromebooks, I was unable to pull it up on the Promethean board, and this impacted their design of the Canvas because I was planning on giving a quick tutorial on how to use it and some of the features that you can use on Canva to make your presentations look great, but for whatever reason it was blocked by Cumberland and I was unable to access it on the Promethean board. So I think that would have made their Canvas look more professional, which is another way students were graded. Overall, I'm very happy with the way my students grew throughout this unit. All my objectives were right around that 80% target line that I was looking for, and that's even with my third lesson getting cut extremely short. So with more time, more exposure, those results would have been that much better. If this experience taught me one thing, it's that I can do this full time. I felt, especially at the high school level, that this would be a great fit for me, but until you're in it day in, day out, you never really know for sure. You start to experience things that you really just don't get in the practicum experiences. There were two major differences that I felt from student teaching to practicum. One is that the planning side of it. I know how much work I put into the practicum lessons that I did, and if I put that much work into these lessons, I'd still be planning for week 2. Because of how labor-intensive those practicum experiences were, I feel that it prepared me to implement really good lessons without having to go through that whole lesson planning process of practicum. The second biggest difference, I would say, is the student connections. I can't tell you more than 3 or 4 kids' names from my practicum teachings. When you're in practicum, you are there's so much you have to plan for in such a short time, and you're just so focused on the lessons going well that it kind of makes the students an afterthought. In student teaching, I made so many close relationships and bonds that I wasn't really sure I was going to be able to make. I was always pretty good at connecting with kids as a coach, but I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make those same connections in the classroom. The reason I was unsure of this is because I've never really been my true self in the classroom because of that practicum pressure of making sure that you get everything in on time. But after taking over the class for about a week, I started to become more myself and started to really get my teacher voice on, and I could see it, and so could the kids. I mean, once I got comfortable in the classroom, I just became more personable, and the kids, I think the kids fed off of that vibe. That's when the relationships really started to grow, and the next thing that I learned is that not all classes are the same. I taught the same lesson to 3 different 9th grade classes, and the makeup of those classes were completely different. Each class really has their own personality regardless of grade. Behaviors and class size play a big factor in this as well. I was able to fly through a lesson with one class, and the next class with the same grade, same number of students, I was only able to get to half of that same lesson. This led me to my last thing, which is time management. In practicum, I was so anxious about trying to get to everything in my lesson. It was very relieving to know that because I'm in student teaching, I was able to push some stuff off to the next day, right? Not having that pressure of getting everything in that one class period that you need to get to. Um, as long as you take good notes, you can just pick up right where you left off with that class. Here's a link to my data sheets from the pre, post, and lesson summatives. And lastly, here's my reference page. Thanks for listening.